Hello and welcome to the Ciao Bella Midnight Spell mini album tutorial series designed for Scrap and Create. All of the products that are available on the Scrap and Create website are linked in the description box below, so you can click on those links, purchase those products to follow along. Let's get started. If you are new to following my tutorials, these videos are designed for you to pause the video to complete the steps and then move on to the next step as I go throughout the album. You will not see me doing a lot of gluing or other things that can be done off camera, but if there is something that needs to be done on camera to show you exactly how I'm doing something, I will do that on camera to show you. In this tutorial, we are going to begin constructing the cover for our album. So you'll need to start with some chipboard. I'm using my heavyweight chipboard here. I have two pieces that are cut to 7 3/4 by 8 1/4. And I have one piece for the spine that's cut to 2 1/2 by 8 1/4. Next, I have two pieces of my white cardstock that are cut to 8 1/2 by 9 1/4. And then I have drawn a horizontal line at 1/2 inch on the bottom of both of my pieces as guidelines for placing my chipboard, which I'll show you in just a moment. You'll need to cut one piece that measures 4 1/2 by 9 1/4. I didn't do this yet, but I do need to draw a 1/2 inch guideline down here at the bottom of this piece. Then you'll need to cut a piece that measures 4 1/4 by 8 1/8 inch. We're going to use one of our pieces of cardstock and one of our pieces of chipboard. I'm going to use my tacky glue for this, and I'm going to be applying my adhesive to the entire backside of this chipboard piece. Now you don't want to put too much adhesive on here because that can cause some problems and warp your paper, but you want to make sure that you have enough that your paper is adhered really well. The more albums that you make and do, the more comfortable you will get with how much glue you do need for each step. You can use your double-sided tape here if you prefer to do so, but as I mentioned in other tutorials, if you know anything about the things that I like to make, I typically always use my tacky glue. Once I have my adhesive down, I am going to use that guideline that I placed at 1/2 inch just to sit this down right on that edge. And then I'm going to just look side to side and center this so that there is about an even amount of paper on each side. And then I'll use my bone folder just to burnish this down so that it has a really good hold. Then I do like to flip mine over and burnish from the back side as well. And now once I have this done, I will take my scissors and I'm going to cut at a diagonal, but I'm not cutting right up against that corner. I'm cutting and leaving about 1/8 inch past my corner so that I can use that paper to wrap that corner completely. So I'm doing the same thing on all 4 of my corners. And that'll get some of the bulk out of my corners, but it'll help me to be able to wrap those corners too. Next, I'm going to just fold my paper over on 2 of my sides. Then I'll take my bone folder and crease this too. I like to go up the sides just to make sure that it's really tight up against the cover. And then I'll run my bone folder right across the top, and I will do the same thing on this one. Now I'm going to take my adhesive and apply adhesive to this entire little tab section here so that I can completely cover this first side. Once the adhesive is on, I'm just going to flip this up, using my bone folder to burnish everything down. Then I'm going to repeat on this side, doing the same thing. First adding my adhesive, then I will fold this over use my bone folder to burnish it down. Once I have my first two sides wrapped, I'm going to take my bone folder and I'm going to press my paper around these corners. So it's really just pressing that paper to cover just a little tiny bit, just that tip of that corner. Then I'm going to fold that side over, just like I did with the first two sides. And now I'm going to come up here with my bone folder and crease these two sides around the edge. Taking my adhesive, I'm just going to apply that to my little tabs here and carefully wrap to make sure that those corners are completely covered with paper. Once that one is complete, I'm going to do the same thing with my final side to finish wrapping our first album cover. And now that my first album cover is wrapped, I'm going to bring in my second piece of cardstock and my second cover, and I'll wrap this one the same way I did this one, but I'm going to do this one off camera. So you can go ahead and pause your video and wrap this cover, then I'll come back and show you how to wrap the spine. Once your covers are finished, you'll need your piece that measures 4.5 by 9.25. Make sure it has the 1/2 inch piece down at the bottom. Then you'll need your chipboard spine piece. So we're going to start just like we did with the covers, and we are going to adhere the spine piece to the center of that cardstock piece. So I'm just going to cover this back side first with my adhesive, and then I'm going to use that 1/2 inch guide down at the bottom to place this in the appropriate position. I'm going to also use the grid on my mat here to try to place this on the sides so that I have about an equal amount of cardstock on both sides. Then I'll adhere this down. And once I have that adhered down, I'm going to take on my short edges, I'm going to fold this over. Then I'll use my bone folder to adhere this, or to fold this over. And I'm going to hold this here in the center. Then I'm going to press my cardstock up against my spine piece. And then I'm going to press this down. So I will press my cardstock up against the piece and then press this down. Now I want this to wrap those edges really tightly, and when I do that, my paper actually is going to go down at a slight angle on each side, and that is what I want. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom section, making sure that it's wrapped tightly around. Holding this in the center, I will place my bone folder up against that spine piece, and then press this down. Now open both of these up, and I'm going to place my adhesive across this entire 1/2 inch tab section first. And then I'm just going to rewrap just like I did previously, making sure that it's adhered first, nice and flat to the center portion. Then I will press it up against my spine and flatten those edges. So I'm basically making little wings on the side of my spine. And now I will apply my adhesive to the 1/2 inch tab section on the top portion. Flip this over, make sure it's nice and flat, and then wrap the sides, creating those little wings. Once I have my piece like this, I'm going to flip over to the outside. I'm going to take my bone folder, I'm going to hold this down, and I'm going to run my bone folder very carefully at first, just so that I can mark this. I'm going to mark right up that spine piece, and then I'm going to go a little bit harder. You want to make sure you don't rip the paper though, so I'm just adding a little bit more pressure to wrap that paper right down that spine piece. I'll do the same thing on this side, just very lightly at first so that I know where my spine piece is, and then applying more pressure so I can wrap that chipboard with that paper. So now when I come over to this side, I don't know if you'll be able to see it if I hold it like this, but my cardstock is actually flat with my spine on this side, and it's a little bit lower on this side, which is what we want. So this is how we're going to adhere our covers to our spine piece, which is what we'll do next. I'm going to use my ruler as a way to line this up straight. So I'm going to take my spine piece and I'm going to apply adhesive on this side. So not on this side, we're going to adhere on this side here. So I'm just going to place my adhesive very carefully, making sure that I don't go over onto the spine section. I don't want to get my glue there. I just want to keep it on that tab or that wing so that my cover will be lined up. Now this is called the lay flat method. It is different than the wrap method. You don't need to leave a space between your spine and your cover. So we're going to be placing our cover right up against that spine. So I have my ruler here. I'm placing my spine piece directly against it, and then I'm going to take my cover, line it up right next to my spine, and then I'm going to make sure that my ruler is pressed up against the edge of both my spine and my cover to make sure everything is straight and flat. And then I'll use my bone folder here to burnish this down. Now I'll flip over on the inside and burnish here. I'm going to flip mine around because it's easier for me to do, especially on camera, on this side, but we're going to place our second cover. So I'm going to repeat that same process where I'm going to first apply my adhesive here to that wing section. Once I have my adhesive on, I'm going to make sure that everything is lined up straight across the bottom and on my ruler. Then I'm going to take my second cover piece, place it right next to my spine piece with no space, and I'll make sure that everything is lined up nice and straight at the bottom, which should also make the top lined up nice and straight too. And then I'm going to use my bone folder to adhere this down. Once that's on, I'll go ahead and flip over and burnish from the inside to give this a really good adherence to make sure everything is nice and adhered. So I do have that complete on the outside. We need to add one more piece on the inside to cover that spine. That's where this piece comes in. So it's 4 1/4 by 8 1/8. and it should fit right on this spine piece in the inside. It'll be slightly smaller top and bottom because our album is 8 1/4 inches, and this is 8 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to go ahead and apply my adhesive to the entire back side of this piece so that I can go ahead and adhere this down. If you are using double-sided tape here, you want to make sure that this entire piece is covered, because if not, when you go to place your hinges and your pages, it will lift off of the spine, and you do not want that to happen. And if you are using adhesive like I am, if you're using wet adhesive, you just want to be careful and make sure that you don't put too much adhesive, but you do want to make sure that the entire thing is covered so that this piece is connected at all places to that chipboard spine section. So I will use those edges as a guide, and then eyeing it top and bottom so that it's even. And then I will use my bone folder again just to burnish this down. I'm going to set this aside and let this dry completely before I come back and crease this and fold this into the book shape. So while this is drying, we're going to move in here and we are going to do our hinges for our album. We're going to cut 2 pieces of cardstock for our hinges. The first one measures 2.5 by 8 inches. We're going to place the 2.5 inch side up against our scoreboard, and we're going to score this every 1/2 inch. So we're going to score at 1/2 inch, at 1 inch, at 1.5, and at 2 inches. Next, we're going to take our scissors from the first score line inward. We're going to miter just that end 1/2 inch tab on both sides. This is going to allow us to place our pages down on that hinge, but it won't slide any further than it needs to be. So this is my first hinge section. For the second hinge, we need 1 piece that measures 3.5 by 8 inches. Now we're going to place the 3.5 inch side up against the scoreboard, and we're going to score this piece also every 1/2 inch. So at 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3 inches. Just like the other hinge, we are going to go from the first score line inward on this 1/2 inch tab on each of the outside 1/2 inch tabs and miter those ends. Once we have our hinges complete, now we're going to go ahead and prepare them and get them ready for the inside of our album. Now I'm just going ahead and erasing my measurements because they will show up later whenever I go to decorate my album, and I don't want them to show. This is the side I scored on, so I'm just going to flip over from the back side. I always start in the center and score this, and fold this, on the score lines. And I like to start in the center and then work my way down while holding the paper. And if I do that, you'll notice my paper did not shift. It is perfectly straight on the top and bottom. Then I'm going to open that one up, and I'm going to repeat that process starting in the center, holding my paper and making sure that it doesn't shift and move, because it's really easy to do. Then I'll come over to this side and do the same thing, holding that paper in place and then burnishing on that score line. Same thing with this final one. So now I have my hinges and my tabs in one direction, I'm going to flip my paper over and fold each of them in the opposite direction and burnish again. This will allow those pages to move a little bit easier and more freely when I open my book and go to flip those pages. So I do have my first hinge ready to go. I'm going to repeat that process with the second hinge, again starting in the center. I'm just going to work my way in one direction first, and I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to burnish in the opposite direction. So if you want to pause the video here and do this step, we will come back and I'll show you how to attach these together and then how we're going to attach them in the album. I have my pieces folded and ready to go. So the first thing I'm going to do with my larger hinge is I've got two of my sections on this side. I'm going to fold over and just burnish again. I've got two sections on this side. I'm going to fold over and burnish again. Then I'm just going to fold these ones up to show you. These are going to be page 1 and page 4. You've got 3 sections in the center that you want to focus on. Now I'm just going to put an X. You don't need to do this, but I'm going to put an X in my center one so that you can see hopefully a little bit better. Now this is where I'm going to adhere this smaller hinge. So I'm going to fold 2 up on each side, and I have my middle section. This middle section is going to go in the middle section of that one where my X is. I will be placing my adhesive here in the center, covering the entire half-inch section with my adhesive to make sure that it's really adhered well down to that second hinge piece and doesn't lift off once it's in the album and the pages are attached. Now, once I have my adhesive on, I'm going to go ahead and lay this down starting at the bottom, and I'm going to use my score line as a guide for placing this. Once I've put this on, I'm going to move it over slightly just to make sure it's adhered. It's a little harder to do this with your double-sided tape because once you put it down, it's stuck down. But the nice thing about your wet adhesive is you do have a little bit of kind of wiggle room that you can move this and reposition it slightly if needed. Once I have that in that center section, I'll go ahead and adhere that down. Make sure that it is flat. Then I'll fold this one over, burnish this one down, and just make sure everything is nice and flat and everything is adhered together. So once I flip those 2 up and the end 2 up, I've got all 4 of my hinges for my page. So my page will attach here, and then I've got like a hinge extension, I like to call it, so that the pages will lay flatter. I'm going to flip this over to the back side. These 3 center sections are what's going to be attached to the album cover. So we'll bring that in next and work on that. I have my album cover here next with my ruler. Now I use a centering ruler, which is really beneficial when you're making a mini album. If you're not using a centering ruler, you'll need to measure 3/4 of an inch over from each side and make a mark top and bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and mark mine here. Going to do the same thing here. Then when I take my spine piece with those 3 flattened pieces, when I place this here on my spine in the center, I'm also going to have a 1/2 inch on the front and back side of my hinge piece. Taking my adhesive, I'm going to be very careful when doing this. I'm going to apply my adhesive to all 3 of those center sections on the larger hinge piece. Now that I have my spine covered with my adhesive, I'm just going to go ahead and use those marks that I've put in here to line up my spine, excuse my head for a moment here, and using that paper, it's going to be a little bit smaller than my paper. So I'm going to have about a 1/16 of an inch smaller on top and bottom, or it's about 1/8 of an inch if you look at the top and bottom of your album cover itself. So your spine section will have a little bit of a border around it whenever the album is finished. So I'm just going ahead and adhering everything down really well. And then if you do see any of your marks, like you can still see mine, I'm just taking a clean eraser. My other one's kind of dirty. And I'm just going to erase those marks since it is white paper and I don't want to see those when my book is complete. I do have all of my hinges in my album now, so I'm going to go ahead and start bending this cover. It has been some time since it was made, so it should be fine whenever I go to fold it. I'm going to just take my bone folder first and very lightly run my bone folder into that crease. Then I'm going to just lift up slightly on my cover as I'm running that bone folder in that fold. Then I'll just use the cover to flip this up and over. Now I'm going to do the same thing on this side. First, just running it down that crease just to get started. And whoop! Then I'm going to go ahead and lift up on my cover as I am running that bone folder in the crease, and then I'll flatten it over the top. So now I have my book. I've got my spine section covered. I've got just this little gap here between whenever it is folded, but it is completely up against it whenever it is open, and the cover lays completely flat, hence the name, the lay flat method. Now that our cover is finished, we're going to go ahead and move on to building the base pages for our album. So we are going to be building 4 pages. You'll need to cut 4 pieces that measure 7 inches by 9 inches. Now on the 9-inch side, we're going to place this up against the scoring board and score at 1/2 inch and 8.5 inches. Now you'll want to do this on all 4 of your pieces. And we're going to take our scissors from the score line inward. We are going to miter these corners just like that. The reason we do this is because it's easier to slide those photo mats in and out of the pocket pages. When those corners are mitered, it doesn't hit on that paper as much, so it'll just slide in a little bit easier. Next, you're going to need to cut 4 pieces that measure 7 inches by 8 inches, and you don't need to do anything to this piece. For the pieces that we scored, we need to fold these score lines. So I scored on this side of the paper. I'm going to flip over and fold into that score line. Then I'm going to use my bone folder to burnish. And I will do the same thing on this one. Then I'm going to flip over and burnish from this side. And this is what's going to allow your pages to lay flatter. So the more you burnish these, the flatter or tighter your pockets will be. Next, I'm going to flip this over using my adhesive. I'm going to apply my adhesive here first to one of my tabs. Now you can use double-sided tape here if that's what you prefer. I just prefer using my tacky glue, so that's what I'm doing. Once I have my adhesive on my tab, I'm going to take my other paper and I am going to line up the edges at the top, which should also line up the edges at the bottom and the sides. Once everything is lined up, I'll go ahead and use my bone folder to burnish this down. Then open up and burnish from the inside. Next, I will take my adhesive and I'm going to apply my adhesive here to this second tab section, just like I did with the first one. And then starting from the first one, I'm going to fold this so it's nice and flat. Then I'm going to burnish this down. And this is going to make that pocket a nice tight pocket that will lay flat and not be too bulky or too open where things fall out when you're flipping your pages. Now we have our page finished. I'm going to mark my page. I've already marked my other ones. So I marked mine page for front, page for back. And I do this so that it's easier for me whenever I am going through the album to make sure that when I do the interactive pieces, I have the right page and in the right orientation. So I did the same thing that I just showed you for my other 3 pages, and I have all 4 of my pages ready. So you'll want to stop, pause the video, and finish your other 3 pages. This is where the page is going to go on the hinge, and then this is where the photo mat will go that will slide in and out of the pocket. And that's it for this tutorial. So in the next tutorial, we will begin working on the interactive elements for our pages, starting with page 1. Now, if you are just joining the tutorial series, go ahead and look in the description box below for the links for all the products for the Ciao Bella Magic Spell collection. Everything is linked to the Scrap and Create website, as well as a list of other products that you will need to complete your album. I'll see you in the next tutorial.